All right, last but not least, we have John Tierney from the New York Times. Please help me welcome John Tierney.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be sharing the podium with these distinguished researchers. When I used to do a science blog at the New York Times, I had a little bio box at the top that said, John Tierney always wanted to be a scientist, but he went into journalism because its peer review process was a great deal easier to sneak through. And I'm really happy that I snuck through today, and especially at SPSP. When I started writing a science column for the Times in 2007, the first meeting I went to was SPSP. And I thought it would be fun at that meeting to drag a social psychologist out to Graceland and explain what the pilgrims were doing at Elvis's shrine. And I asked Ben Carey, the social science reporter for the Times, if he could suggest someone. And he said, well, you would probably need somebody with kind of a wide-ranging mind for that. So why don't you try Roy Baumeister? And I wrote to Roy, and he immediately emailed back like 6 angles for writing about why people go to Graceland. And we never had time to go to Graceland because there was so much good stuff going on at SPSP, but that was what led us to collaborate on a book, Willpower, and we're writing another book now, so I have to say SPSP has been very, very good to me. And I'm very glad to be at this session, although I've got some qualms about the title, The Joy of Giving Science Away. As someone who makes his living writing and speaking, I would prefer the joy of selling science. And I say that it's not just about the money. I mean, I think that to reach a mass audience, you have to sell your ideas, you know, to a reporter, to an editor, to a TV producer. And social scientists face one big disadvantage in competing in this marketplace, and that is that any finding you report about human behavior can be dismissed by an editor who says, my grandmother knew that. And you know, at the story meetings at the New York Times, when I'm pitching stuff, I'm sometimes jealous of the people who have other beats because the editor's grandmother never heard of the Higgs boson already. So it's a much easier thing to sell. But social psychologists also have one huge advantage over everyone else when it comes to getting their research covered, and that is that you study the favorite topic of readers, which is themselves. They care a lot more about themselves and reading about what they do than they do about the Higgs boson, than they do about politics, than they do about a lot of the hard news stories that used to dominate the front pages of newspapers. And that has changed with the web because we now have these new metrics for gauging reader interest. We have the most emailed list, the most viewed list, and that has really shown editors that how much interest there is in social psychology. It showed them, how much demand there is for that. And it's taught journalists, I think, that many of us have realized that we're in some ways in the same business, you are. That we're trying to tell people what they do and why they do it. And many of us have realized that you do a better job of that, and that we have done a pretty lousy job. The traditional techniques for journalists have been, if you want public opinion, you go do a man-on-the-street interview and you talk to a few people until you find someone who says something that you agree with. And then, or you kind of fabricate these trends. There's an old rule in journalism that 3 anecdotes makes a trend. And it's not entirely a joke. So the appeal of social psychology, that it really came to me, I've always liked science, but especially when I started writing a column for the New York Times magazine called The Big City. It was a column about New York, and it was supposed to be what New Yorkers were like. But so much had been written about New York, there were so many cliches, that it was kind of hard to think what would be new to say. And so I was really happy when a social psychologist, Bob Levine, who's now at California State University, he came to New York, and he went to 35 other cities too. And he did these experiments on the sidewalk, testing people's willingness to help a stranger. Like if someone asked them to make change for a quarter, would they do it? Well, he found, after going to 36 cities, that New Yorkers ranked dead last. that, that only 29% of New Yorkers would make change for a quarter. And now everybody's grandmother knew that New Yorkers are rude, but it was still news. It still made a lot of news because it was such it was such a fun experiment, and also it was such a clear result, and it was compelling. And from my standpoint, the great thing was by introducing this experimental method, that it made it possible to replicate that and to tweak it so that we could answer another question, which is, why are New Yorkers so rude? Now, is it their nature, or is it the environment? So I consulted with Bob Levine, and he was very kind with his guidance. And I went down to Nashville, which was the most polite, most helpful city in the country, according to Bob's research. And I hired a Confederate, and I wanted to create some New York conditions there. So I hired a Confederate who stood at the corner, and when a pedestrian walked by, he would ask the pedestrian what time it was, and then he'd ask him for $2. Then the pedestrian would keep walking down the block, and I would accost him in the middle of the block, and I would ask for directions to the bus station. And then I would tell him a hard luck story, and I would ask him for $10. And then he would keep going down the block, and my other Confederate was at the corner, and he would do the experiment. He asked him to make change for a quarter. Well, in the original study, 60% of Nashvillians had given change for the quarter. But after they ran my little panhandlers gauntlet, just 2 people, that figure went down to 20%. And what amazed me was that this was actually lower than the figure in New York in the original study. So, and this was just on one block they'd experienced. New Yorkers, have to go through this all day long. So this enabled me to reach a conclusion that Eli might think is a little pushing it, but I wrote, New Yorkers must have astonishing reservoirs of charity. To put it in technical terms, the data clearly demonstrate that New Yorkers are the nicest doggone people in America. I don't think that was too strong, do you? No. Now, I'm not holding that up as a model of social science, but I think it does illustrate a couple of principles that are useful when you're trying to share your research with the public in any way. The first principle was something, it's been said in various ways, but my favorite was when Bill Safire retired from writing his op-ed column at the New York Times, and I was taking that column. I asked him, what advice he had gleaned from decades of writing this column. What did he have to pass on? And he had one simple sentence. He said, a column should make exactly 1 point. Now, and that's harder to do than it sounds. Now, and he's talking about this kind of weird little form of an op-ed column, which is 600 words, and it's very, and you do that. And when you write a longer column, and I write a longer column now, which I like better because you can actually say more, but that basic concept of boiling it down to 1 point, to one take on a subject, I think is crucial for selling ideas and for attracting readers. Now, I'm not saying that you should hype the point. I mean, I think Eli's point was a great one, that we have evidence that writing that IOU note will help your relationship, and we have more evidence for that than for giving them lingerie. I don't think you have to say it's the most thing. But it's good discipline on whether you're trying to write an essay yourself or whether you're simply going to be interviewed by a reporter, is to sit down and think, what's the point of this? What do you want to get across? What did the study show, and why is it important? And to write 1, 2, or at most 3 sentences summarizing what that is, to have your talking point ready if a reporter calls you. I mean, in the old newspaper jargon, it's called the nut graph. It's usually like the 4th or 5th paragraph in an article where that one paragraph has the kernel of the story. In news magazines, they used to call it the why you are invited to this party paragraph. And so doing that, I think, is good discipline. Now, the second principle is an old rule in the magazine business, which is that a story idea should be a verb, not a noun. Cognitive dissonance is not a magazine idea. The story of how it was discovered, the story of how it's being challenged, the story of how one person or one group illustrate this, that's a magazine story. Now, the good thing about social psychology is that sometimes an experiment is enough for that narrative, like Bob Levine's experiments on the sidewalk of New York. But often you have to try and figure out other ways to do it. The biggest challenge for me often when I'm writing a long magazine story, when I'm writing a chapter in a book, is trying to figure out, how to turn that noun into a verb. I mean, back when type A personality research by Meyer Friedman was the rage, I was assigned to do a story on that. And sometimes you can do this by turning it into a story about your quest to find something. And so I went out to Meyer Friedman's lab in San Francisco, and I was trained to give the type A test. And then the magazine had a nice travel budget. I went to Western Samoa. I went to a far island, to this remote village, and I went and I gave the type A test to the high talking chief of the village. And he turned out to be a type B executive. So that was a fun way to do it. But I think often, the best stories, the best narratives are the ones where it's someone else's story. And how you find those stories is pretty haphazard. I mean, in the Willpower book, we tried to turn the noun of self-control into a verb we wrote about someone who made a living by working as a living statue in squares. We wrote about, the endurance feats of David Blaine and did some historical stuff from Henry Morton Stanley. I wrote for the pop culture stuff about a nanny for the show Nanny 911, who would go into people's homes and turn their brats into self-controlled kids. Now, obviously there's nothing scientific about those stories, and I understand the pitfalls that Eli raises, and I realize that the plural of anecdotes is not data. But I do think that when you combine the solid research you do, and you summarize it accurately, clearly but accurately, when you combine that, once you boil it down to the main point so it's clear, and when you combine that with the power of a narrative, you really end up with something that is not only entertaining, but it's enlightening. And also because of the kind of work you do, because you're dealing with people, it's something that can really be helpful to people. One of the greatest pleasures I've had of my collaboration with Roy Baumeister in our book is that we have just continued to get letters from people who say, reading your book changed my life, I can now do this and I couldn't do that before. And it's just immensely gratifying. And I have to admit that it is even more gratifying when they say they were so inspired that they bought copies of the book for their friends. That is the joy of selling science. Thank you.